Have you ever wondered why people get so angry about literary theory? I mean, it sounds like a pretty abstract academic debate, right? But for decades, it's been the cause of these incredibly fierce arguments. Well, in a really famous and, frankly, controversial essay, the critic Paul de Man suggested that the answer is way stranger than any of us think. So, get this. The story of this essay actually starts with a rejection. The Modern Language Association asks de Man to write a piece introducing literary theory. And what does he send them? An essay arguing that the single most important thing about theory is that you can't actually define it. Shocker, right? They turned it down. But that central paradox, that theory's whole point is that it resists definition, that's exactly what we're going to unpack. And just who was the man behind this kind of thinking? Well, Paul de Man was this towering, almost intimidating intellect at Yale. He was a central figure in the deconstruction movement, and he was absolutely revered. But then, after his death, a huge scandal erupted with the discovery of pro-Nazi articles he wrote during the war. And that forces us, even today, to read his work on language, on truth, and on ideology with a really unsettling new lens. Okay, so de Man starts by looking at the most obvious reason for all the drama, what people call the theory wars. This was the big, public fight that pitted two completely different ways of studying literature against each other. So let's lay out the battlefield. On one side, you've got your traditional literary criticism. This is all about finding beauty, moral meaning, and historical context in a work. But then on the other side, this new thing called theory comes along, and it's asking a totally different question. It's not interested in what a text means, but how it's put together, basically using the tools of linguistics to pop the hood and take the engine apart. De Man had this really clever way of describing how the traditionalists reacted. He said first they tried to dismiss theory as this big, dangerous tiger. But when it didn't completely destroy literature, they backtracked and called it a harmless paper tiger. De Man's real point, though, is this. If it was so trivial, why was everyone so terrified of the cat to begin with? That anxiety, that fear, that was the real story here. And that anxiety, it pointed to something much deeper. Because the real revolution of theory wasn't just about a new set of opinions. No, it was a fundamental shift in focus that put language itself, the very medium we're using, right under the microscope. So here's the key idea. According to de Man, theory was really born the moment that linguistic terms entered the meta-language, and all that means is the language we use to talk about literature. Suddenly, the conversation wasn't just about history or beauty anymore. It was about a scientific-style analysis of language as a system of signs. And this is the fundamental shift. Theory basically hits pause on our common-sense idea that language is just this clear window we look through to see reality. Instead, it says, hold on. Language is its own complex system with its own rules and its own behaviors. And crucially, it might not line up with the real world at all. This leads to a whole new way of thinking about what makes literature literary. For de Man, it wasn't about being beautiful or just imitating reality. Instead, literariness is that moment in a text where the language itself is on full display, where it shows us that its connection to reality isn't a sure thing. It's the moment language reveals its own untrustworthy but incredibly powerful nature. Okay, so we've got this big, noisy battle raging between the traditional critics and the new theorists. But just when we think we've got a handle on the conflict, de Man pulls the rug out from under us. He argues that this whole external fight, it's just a symptom of a much deeper, more fundamental resistance happening inside. You know, it's totally natural to want to pick a side here. Are the theorists right to question everything, or are the traditionalists right to defend meaning and value? Who's winning? But de Man suggests this is completely the wrong question to be asking. He says the fight we see happening on the surface, it's just a distraction. It's a misdirection from a conflict that's happening somewhere else entirely. And here it is. This is the absolute core of his argument. The most powerful, most profound resistance to theory doesn't come from its opponents. It comes from within theory itself. It's a problem that's built right into the very language of theory.
So you might think, well, doesn't that just invalidate the whole project? But de Man says absolutely not, and he uses this incredible analogy. He says that would be like rejecting the science of anatomy just because it hasn't cured mortality. Look, the whole point of anatomy is to understand the body, death and all. And the point of theory is to understand language, self-resistance and all.
So what exactly is this internal resistance? Well, this is where de Man drills down to the absolute heart of the problem. He says this resistance, both the one we see on the outside and the hidden one on the inside, is ultimately a resistance to one single fundamental act: the act of reading. This is it. This is the big reveal. For de Man, all the arguments, all the academic turf wars, they are really just sophisticated ways of avoiding the uncomfortable, unsettling truths that pop up when we really read a text, when we truly follow its language wherever it might lead us, no matter how strange. Now, to explain why reading is so unsettling, de Man goes all the way back to the classical trivium, the three ancient arts of language. You've got grammar and logic, and they seem to work together really well, promising a stable, clear path to meaning. But then you've got the wild card, rhetoric, the world of metaphors, of figures of speech. And rhetoric is constantly threatening to mess up that neat and tidy system. De Man gives this fantastic example using the title of a Keats poem. Grammatically, the fall of Hyperion could just mean Hyperion's fall, a finished event in the past that you can observe from a safe distance. But it could also mean Hyperion falling, a continuous active process that's happening right now, a process that you, the reader, might actually be caught up in. See the problem? Both of those readings are grammatically perfect, but they are rhetorically incompatible. You can't hold both meanings at once, and no amount of grammar checking is going to help you decide which one is correct. This right here is what de Man calls undecidability. It's that moment where the figurative power of language just short-circuits its own grammar, and you're left staring into the instability of meaning itself.
And this brings us to the absolutely astonishing conclusion of de Man's essay, a paradox that kind of leaves us teetering on the very edge of certainty.
You see, for de Man, real, authentic reading isn't some comforting process where we find a nice, stable meaning. No, it's a negative process. It's where the solid ground of grammar is constantly being washed away by the disruptive tides of rhetoric. It's really an experience of unknowing things you thought you knew. And that is why the resistance can never, ever be overcome, because theory is the name we give to this whole process. Theory is the language of language's own self-resistance. It's the methodical exploration of its own endless internal conflict. So, in the end, literary theory becomes this pretty mind-bending thing, the universal theory of its own impossibility. Its greatest triumph is to demonstrate with painstaking rigor that language can never be a perfectly stable, perfectly reliable system for making sense of the world. And de Man leaves us with this final, haunting question. Theory thrives on the resistance to it. In fact, the more it's attacked, the more it proves its own point. But is this constant flourishing of self-analysis a triumph of critical thought? Or is it a fall into a kind of void where nothing can ever be truly known? That, he says, is what remains impossible to decide.